EU sanctions have made it tough for Russians and Belarusians to work in the bloc. But could Hungary now be giving them a way in? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Hungary's decision to ease visa rules for Russian and Belarusian citizens looks set to be another thorn in the side for Brussels. Critics of Budapest's move fear it could open the door to Russian spies travelling freely around the Schengen area. Hungary says its new national card rules don't pose a risk to the bloc. So, what are the possible consequences for the EU?
Earlier this year, Hungary introduced a national card as a new residence permit. It aims to simplify procedures for workers from neighboring countries like Serbia and Ukraine. But in mid-July, Russian and Belarusian citizens were added to the list of eligible countries. And this move has created tensions across Europe.
For our position throughout our policies, Russia is a security threat to the EU, and hence all instruments at union level, at member state level, need to ensure the safety of the union and also to take into account the security of the Schengen.
Under European regulations, EU members can set their own rules for migration and work permits. However, individuals with a visa can generally travel freely within the Schengen zone. Over 67 members of the European Parliament have written an open letter to the European Commission to address potential security risks associated with this policy. The Commission gave Hungary until August 19th to explain its new visa rules, but Budapest did not respond. According to Hungary's statistical office, there are now almost 8,000 Russian citizens living in the country, more than double the number from a decade ago and up 20% since the start of the Ukraine war in 2022. As a response, Hungarian Minister for European Union Affairs János Boka published a letter. He said, Hungary puts a great emphasis on European and national security, on the contrary of European concerns. Some say the construction of a new nuclear power plant in Hungary is the reason for this incentive, since Budapest will need Russian engineers and specialized workers for this project. Aside from this, Russian investments in Hungary are still limited, and additionally, Belarusian investments are minimal.
Hungary's visa policy controversy highlights broader EU tensions over balancing security and immigration. As the situation unfolds, the EU and Hungary will need to navigate these complex border control and national security issues. Serena Shanchai for Roundtable, TRT World, Brussels.
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Brussels is Jamie Shea. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Ines Neves is a lawyer and a lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the University of Porto. And in Moscow, we have Dmitry Babich. He is Deputy Foreign Editor of the Komsomolskaya Pravda daily. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Jamie, I'll come to you first. I'm interested in the timing of this. 2 days after Viktor Orban returned from Moscow, he implements this new visa scheme. What can we read into this?
Well, Viktor Orban is currently occupying the presidency, the 6-monthly rotating presidency of the European Union. So it's certainly a platform for him to take diplomatic initiatives, to travel around, although he's speaking, I think, more for Hungary than he is at the moment for the European Union, and to profile himself on the international scene. So in terms of attracting a lot of publicity and making a statement, this is a good time for him, particularly with the EU institutions on vacation and the new EU leadership after the elections last June not yet in place. There's a kind of vacuum in Brussels that I think he's exploiting for his own purposes. But surely it's not good news for the EU, particularly at a time when it wants solidarity, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, also Belarus, another country that Orban is now relaxing entry requirements for. It's a break with EU policy. And in terms of securing the EU's external border, it's going to be a headache for the EU, because what does it do? Accept this, and therefore there's going to be a leak leaky border via Hungary, or does it mean that other countries, Germany, France, and so on, that take these restrictions more seriously, are going to have to sort of go outside the Schengen framework and start putting more national border controls on, precisely because that external border of the EU is no longer as secure as it was before?
Dmitry, Hungary is building a new nuclear power plant. A lot of Russian engineers and Russian technology being involved in this. Are we really to believe that all the thousands of Russians getting these new visas are all working on this nuclear plant?
Well, I don't think the cooperation between Russia and Hungary can be reduced to nuclear energy, even though you probably know that there is already a Soviet-built nuclear power station in Hungary, which works quite well. And in general, Rosatom, our atomic power agency, it has become the flagship of Russian exports, replacing little by little Gazprom, which is now reorienting its exports to China and India. Of course, nuclear energy is important, but I think Orban is just open to Russia. He wants more cooperation. He understands that what we have now between Russia and the European Union is a travesty. It's a new dividing line in Europe because Russia is also Europe. I have been living here for 53 years. I speak 6 European languages, so I can testify that Russia is Europe. It's Eastern Europe, of course, very special kind of Europe, but it is a European country, and the European Union created new dividing lines when it turned down lots of suggestions from Russia, not only from Yeltsin, but also from Putin. There were suggestions to establish a visa-free regime between Russia and the European Union. I think since 2003, Putin has been pushing for that. And it's very unfortunate that European Union is now trying to isolate Russia. And it's very unfortunate that Viktor Orban, the only politician in Europe who went to both Ukraine and Russia, who went also to China, who is trying to do something to end this terrible conflict, he is being criticized. And the other officials in the EU who have done nothing absolutely to prevent this war, who actually helped to start it, they have been praised as the civilized ones, the mainstream ones, the reliable ones.
Thank you, Dmitry.
The most reliable person is the one who seeks peace.
Well, also in Brussels is Andras Laszlo. He's a Hungarian politician and a member of the European Parliament from the Patriots for Europe group. Andras, welcome back to Roundtable. Just tell me, what's the thinking behind this visa scheme now? Previously, it was only open to countries like Ukraine and Serbia, and now 8 others have been added, including Russia and Belarus. What's your government doing here?
Well, this whole issue has been raised in international media. This was not a political issue in Hungary until it came in from abroad. There isn't anything special going on. This is a program which allows for guest workers to come to Hungary and ask for permits for employment and residence at the same time. But the security checks are exactly the same as for any third country national entering the EU. My guess is what's really behind it is a political attack against Hungary, because there are already hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens in the EU with visas to stay in the Schengen zone, and this has never been an issue before. But now, all of a sudden, without really nothing special going on, it's now a political issue, and we have no idea why this has begun, other than for political propaganda purposes.
So, Andras, you think enemies of Hungary, enemies of Viktor Orban are making political capital out of this?
Well, I certainly think so. If you think about what was the news right before this kind of attack started against Hungary, it was that Prime Minister Viktor Orban started a peace mission in order to bring the different warring sides in the Russia-Ukraine war to a negotiating table. And he met several leaders. He first went to Kiev, then he went to Moscow, then he talked with NATO allies, he visited Beijing, and he just wanted to get negotiations going. And this had a very radical reaction from the European Parliament and from many European leaders. And how surprising that only a few days later, this attack was also launched against Hungary. Although, I repeat, there are already several hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens with Schengen visas in Europe, and this was never an issue, nor was Hungarian security checks to people it gave Schengen visa access to.
Ines, I want to look at the legalities of the scheme. So let's just take a look, first of all, at how it works. So card holders can work in Hungary for up to 2 years. It's much simpler than a business visa. It enables family reunification, and after 3 years, you qualify for permanent residency. And crucially, as Andras was saying, access to the Schengen area. Has the Hungarian government done anything wrong here from an EU standpoint?
Well, in fact, each member state is entitled to design and implement its own visa requirements, and the rules for issuing work permits in particular are a matter of national policy, with each EU member state being able to decide on according to its own criteria. This was indeed emphasized by the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs in a letter to Budapest. Also, it is difficult to assess the formal legality of a decree that is lightly regulated and whose legality will certainly depend on how national cards are actually issued and what security checks are carried out with regard to threats to public order, internal security, public health, and international relations. However, while the risk of formal illegality is only potential, there is a risk of what the EU has called a de facto circumvention of EU law and European values, because it is important that we recall that EU member states, even though they have jurisdiction to design and implement their own requirements, they are all bound by common rules and minimum rules, including general principles of EU law, such as loyal cooperation and trust. And national systems must not, of course, jeopardize the integrity of the common space and must also take due account of potential security implications.
Jamie, I'll come to you. How much concern do you think there is in European Union capitals then about what Hungary have done here?
Well, Viktor Orban has made his dissatisfaction with many things that are done in Brussels clear for some time, particularly in holding up, although not ultimately blocking, but holding up, new packages of EU sanctions, looking for opt-outs for Hungary and so on, particularly in the energy area. So this is not, if you like, a one-off. I think it's part of a pattern of a distance that has happened in recent years between Budapest and Brussels. But I think, Viktor Orban sort of chooses his targets carefully. I come from NATO, not the EU. And when it comes to NATO, yes, we've had Viktor Orban holding up, for example, Sweden's membership of the alliance for some time. But when the Turkish parliament eventually went ahead and ratified that, Hungary sort of did the same. So if you like, the relationship of Hungary vis-a-vis NATO is slightly less complex than I think it is with the European Union. Hungary has its specific interests which it defends, notably when it comes to Russian oil and Russian gas, because unlike other EU countries which have largely taken themselves off Russian gas, to some degree at least Russian oil, since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that's a relationship which Hungary has wanted to maintain. Similarly, the relationship with China as well. So I think Viktor Orban's been there for many, many years. I think people are sort of used to him. But when it comes to Hungary occupying the presidency of the EU, where the whole issue is to represent the EU and the EU interest, to consult with the EU, there I think there have been sort of concerns that Hungary hasn't sort of been playing the presidency in that traditional role.
Andras, I'll just come to you on that. So are you concerned that this kind of diminishes the presidency at the moment? Hungary, you have the presidency of the European Union for 6 months. I mean, it's not a great beginning point, is it?
I wouldn't say this is the beginning point. It's been almost a year since leftists and liberals and Greens and socialists have been attacking Hungary and have been trying to prevent Hungary from taking on the role of presidency, even though this is not some kind of a reward. This is a job every member state must do to coordinate meetings on issues of common concern. And these attacks exactly fit into what we've experienced prior to the Hungarian presidency from those who have been trying to prevent the Hungarian presidency. And then when the Hungarian presidency began, and we've been promoting a list of priorities which focus on European competitiveness, which focus on European industry, which focus on security, and of course, which include efforts to have negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. This was received in hysterical fashion, both by EU leaders and some national leaders, as well as the new European Parliament, of which I am member. We from the Patriots group, Patriots for Europe group, we have proposed a resolution to the European Parliament which would support, continued support for Ukraine, but at the same time would call on looking into possible opening doors towards negotiations. This was heavily rejected by the European Parliament, and they pushed forward instead a resolution which was completely pro-war, which calls on several times on member states to provide more military aid to Ukraine. And by the way, Hungary has supported Ukraine since day one of the war. The only thing we didn't do was send weapons or allow weapons shipments to enter Ukraine via Hungary, because we do not want Hungary to be dragged into this war. We are a direct neighbor of Ukraine. Any kind of escalation carries a huge risk, first and foremost, for countries of the region. That's why we're calling for de-escalation, and we're calling for measures that actually work. What we have seen in the last 2.5 years is that those promises made by Ursula von der Leyen, head of the Commission, regarding sanctions, regarding crippling the Russian economy, etc., have all failed. The European strategy has failed, and now it's just a matter of hysteria from Brussels.
Let's bring in Dmitry. So all of the headlines talking about hysteria and Russians, a lot of the headlines I've seen, Dmitry, have suggested that floods of Russian spies will come into Europe and Hungary will be the back door into the Schengen area, and they can then disseminate themselves across the continent and spy for the Kremlin. What's your answer to that kind of rhetoric?
Well, spy mania is a typical feature of totalitarian regimes. The Nazi regime, the communist regimes, they all constantly talked about spies, and they explained their trend to shut off the borders by the fear of foreign espionage. So that doesn't speak in favor of the EU, this kind of rhetoric. And also, as far as I can understand, this program is not only for Russia. It's the so-called national card program, which has been used not only by Ukraine, as you said, but also by Moldova, by North Macedonia, by Bosnia and Herzegovina. And these are poor countries with not very good criminal records, some of them. And still, obviously, the EU understands that it needs sometimes the skills, the manpower from these countries. The same story with Russia. I understand what Ines is saying about de facto breaching the law, even though it's a tricky matter. The law is supposed to be so precise that you cannot breach it de facto. But if we talk about morals and facts here, some of the sanctions imposed by the EU on Russia are just against human rights. They are very dangerous. For example, the decision not to sell to Russia spare parts for the aircraft, including civilian aircraft, which the EU sold to Russia and which the United States sold to Russia. That is a very, very cruel decision. Imagine what will happen if one of these planes finally malfunctions and we have an air crash, we have a disaster with a civilian aircraft. Everyone knows what a terrible tragedy it is. So basically, if we talk about facts, if we talk about human rights, a lot of actions of the EU in this context are against human rights, are against the European values. The main European value is, of course, the life and well-being of individual persons.
Thanks, Dmitry. I want to bring Ines back in. I want to bring Ines back in on the legal side of things. Ines, once these cards have been issued and visas in Hungary, is there anything in the EU legal mechanism that can stop a country, perhaps saying to someone at the border, we don't recognize this?
Well, there are increasing calls in European circles to strip Hungary of its presidency and voting rights. Some countries have argued in favor of the introduction of new controls at the Hungarian borders, if necessary, and member states actually have the right to refuse to recognize visas issued by Hungary. I understand that caution is needed because it is important to assess the de facto compliance with the European Union framework, but it is actually possible to sanction Hungary in several ways. While this will be unusual, it could be possible to invoke Article 7 of the EU Treaty, which applies in the event of a serious and persistent breach of European values. This has been an avenue that is being considered by some political figures, while others have warned that caution is needed. Meanwhile, the EU institutions seem to be adopting some kind of boycotts to the presidency, such as what has happened with the European Commission, that is sending officials instead of commissioners to informal meetings, and other avenues. It is also possible to adopt infringement procedures in case there is a true incompatibility with EU law, which is not a legal means new for Hungary in this context. The Nordic Baltic ministers in particularly are concerned with the information that comes from Hungary with regard to security risks and what kind of checks are being conducted at this stage. So, as I said, the types of sanctions and measures are available. It is important that they follow a thorough evaluation of how these national cards will or are being issued.
Thanks, Ines. Jamie, bring you back in. I know your former employers were NATO, but you've spent a lot of time around Brussels. You know what people think. How is Orban viewed then in the European Parliament?
Well, obviously he has his supporters, and you have one on the programme today, because about 25% of the European Parliament is made up of groups on the right wing of the spectrum, the more populist nationalist European sovereignty groups. And so not just with his own Fidesz party in Hungary, but in others, there will be some sympathy for his views. And people like Fico, who has now returned to power in Slovakia, agrees with some of those views. And again, if you look at the AfD in Germany, which has scored very highly over the weekend in state elections. That's not the German government, of course, but you can see the number of sort of right-wing parties around, many of whom have representation in the European Parliament. So this is a view that resonates. And I suppose if you talk to Viktor Orban, he will try to convince you that European politics, particularly on migration, on going soft on Russia, on Ukraine, ceasing support for Ukraine is a growing trend, and he hopes, like a surfer, that wave is going to get bigger and he can surf it for some time to come. So to some extent, Orban's influence is proportionate a little bit to this mood music within Europe at the moment, and particularly the problem that France and Germany, the two countries that traditionally lead the EU, and I think in more normal times would be pushing back on a lot of Orban's policies, are experiencing a right wave shock at home in the wake of the French elections. There's still no government in France, are going through a period of economic turmoil. And so that sort of leadership, if you like, governmental level to push back isn't there, which is, I think, why we've seen so much of the pushback coming from the European Parliament, of which we've been speaking in the programme today.
Thanks, Jamie. Final word to you, Andras. Viktor Orban, give us a summary of what Hungarian voters think of him, the average person. He remains very popular?
Orban and our party are both very popular. We've scored at the national elections in 2022, 54% of the popular vote, 2/3 majority in the Hungarian parliament. We scored despite two very difficult war-torn years and with many economic difficulties, inflation, energy crisis throughout Europe. We've scored the second best at the European elections this June. We got 45% of the vote. I think that's the second best result after the Maltese Labour Party. So we are still very popular. I don't think it has anything to do with being right-wing, left-wing, riding political waves or surfing political trends that we want to restore peace in Europe. This is not about being right-wing, left-wing. This is common sense. We are asking European leaders to do something to end this war instead of continuously escalating it, prolonging it. Where are the diplomatic efforts by the EU? That was the original thought, the fundamental idea of European integration in the 1950s, that there should be no more wars in Europe and that we should settle conflicts and differences at negotiating tables. Most of European leaders in Brussels today refuse to do that, unfortunately. I hope with the recent elections in Germany, with the elections in the European Parliament in June, and hopefully with the elections coming up in Austria, we'll see that people are moving towards policies and leadership which wants to restore peace in Europe, which wants to restore competitiveness in Europe, and which wants to defend our borders against illegal immigration. Any party who's willing to do that, left or right, will be successful in coming years in Europe.
Andras, thank you, and to Dmitry, Jamie and Ines as well, thank you all. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.